Growing up, you were taught to be expressive, to be passionate, to be imaginative. You were taught to be emotional and make your decisions based on those emotions. So it set the precedent. Later on in life, you developed logical thinking skills, and it became a secondary means of making decisions. So it makes sense as to why emotions compel more of our decisions than logic does. In fact, 80 to 90% of the decisions that we make are based on emotions, and then later we use logic to justify those decisions. But what if I offered you the story of a girl who grew up only with logical reasoning and didn't develop emotional reasoning until later in life? I had a childhood. Neither of my parents worked. The only items in our fridge were pepperoncinis and a gallon of milk. I was not allowed upstairs in my own house. My parents drove a van from the junkyard that had a hole in the floor. And one time, my father brought home a sex worker from the creek behind the strip club, and she lived with us for 6 months. Her name was Rose. My father, he was a narcissist. And my mother, she was in love with the narcissist. The world revolved around my father, and in my father's world, we did not matter. This made sense. When my mother would come to me sobbing, looking for a safe space, I did not hesitate to disregard her vulnerability and remind her of the harsh realities of her situation. My mother was very different from my father. She was imaginative. She was expressive. She was hopeful. And though I wanted to feel for her, it was still my father's world where I was conditioned to neglect emotion and embrace logic. My mother and I lived in my father's world until January 27th, 2017, when my father passed away after a long battle with addiction. My mother, having lost the love of her life, fell into a deep depression. Every single week, like clockwork, I would give my mom these pep talks. Mom, you are going to live a good life. You need to get up. You need to socialize. You need to get a job. You need to make money. You owe it to yourself. On October 21st, 2017, my mom got into a car accident. Again. This wasn't anything new. My mother has crashed every single car she has ever driven. Except this time, it was a little different. The police officer on the scene had let my mother go, thinking that they were doing her a favor because she didn't have a license. My mother came home and she slept for 2 whole days, which again, wasn't anything new. When my mother woke up, however, she told me she had just spoken to my father. Later, we found out that my mother had suffered from a stroke. My mother was hospitalized for months, and then she was placed into a long-term living facility. And during this time, I lived in a house that had once been a home, but at this point, it was simply a reminder. I was heartbroken. I had lost my father less than a year prior, and I was now coming to terms with the fact that my mother was never going to be the mother I had once known. The stroke had changed her and our relationship forever. I was numb. And in that moment, I needed a pep talk. In fact, I needed the same pep talk that I gave my mother time and time again. But nobody was there to give it to me. So I gave it to myself. Taylor, you are going to live a good life. You need to get up. You need to go to school. You need to get good grades. You need to get into college. You need to be successful. You need to be everything that your parents never were. You owe it to yourself. As I sat there, I reflected on the talks that I had with my mother and the choices that she made as a result. She made the choices she had to in order to survive. And it worked for her. However, I knew that if I were to make those same choices, it would not be enough for me. I made the harder choice. I chose to step up for myself and by myself. I chose to make sacrifices. The first sacrifice I made was dinner, out with friends. And instead of dinner, I worked a shift at Starbucks. And instead of a Friday night out, I picked up a shift at the Dairy Queen. I opted out of extracurricular activities at school to go and make sure my mother was receiving quality of care. I was 16 at the time, but then again, I was always required to be older than I was. This experience is what allowed me to choose a different future than what I had grown up expecting. I chose to focus my efforts on academics, something that I had never prioritized before. I became fluent in German, and I visited Germany on a trip that was funded by the school based on my academic success. I became a 2018 National College Prep Scholar. I became a member of FCCLA, where I built the foundation on learning how to lead. Even though there was this cloud of sadness and negativity that kept on trying to creep in, I knew that if I let it, there would be no more survival. So I did the only thing I knew how. I took a step back. I extracted my emotions, and I focused on logic. My hard work paid off. I was able to commit to Thomas Jefferson University, but I didn't stop there. I took a tremendous leap of faith when I applied to be freshman class president as part of the Student Government Association, where I worked to cultivate relationships with students through advocacy and worked to develop partnerships with different clubs and organizations on campus. SGA was no longer just a resume builder, as it started to promote happiness and fulfillment within me. For the first time ever, I not only allowed, but I welcomed emotions when making these decisions. It was almost like the weight of this cloud was lighter. Flash forward 4 years, and I'm student body president and part of several different committees to improve the undergraduate experience here on campus. I have developed relationships with people who have become a staple in my everyday life. Professional relationships are now meaningful to me personally, as SGA members have become those who I depend on. For the first time ever, I created communities that I never knew existed, and the weight of this cloud was far less than ever before. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer surviving. I was learning how to live. For my entire life up until college, I was in survival mode. I focused on logic, and while it did work to help me get by, I knew that if I continued on this path, I would never be happy. I knew that if I was always striving to achieve the next goal, I would never be okay in the now. That was not okay. So I made the harder choice, and I chose to embrace both logic and reasoning. Every day, we make 35,000 choices. And up until this moment right now, I have made the harder choice. It would have been easier for me to let negativity overcome me following my mother's accident, but I made the harder choice, and I chose logic. And then, when I started college, it would have been easier for me to stick to logic, but I made the harder choice, and I chose to find a balance between the two. Harder choices promote confidence and growth. They allow you to discover the furthest bounds of your purpose and create the space you need to redefine yourself. Everyone is driven by both emotions and logic, and while I may find myself on one end of the spectrum, you may find yourself on the opposite, and that is okay. For you, logic may be the harder choice, as you have always focused on emotions. You may have never thought twice about the habit that you've created for your entire life. But in the end, we should all be seeking to reach that balance. But you cannot reach that balance without first acknowledging the imbalance between the two. You may feel stuck. You may feel confined to what you believe is possible. But if you continue to push the boundaries of your own expectations, you will be able to redefine yourself and your possibilities every single day. To redefine yourself in a space that you've always known is one of the hardest things you will ever do. But you will never feel more alive. Looking back, I would not change a single part of my story, because although it wasn't easy, it is what allowed me to work towards finding this perfect balance and to learn how to live. And now I stand here having given my mother those pep talks in an effort to get her to make the harder choice and to live a better life. And now I am encouraging you to do the same. You owe it to yourself.